Well, hello, Gospel Chapel. Pastor Doug here, and I'm here with Rick Moes today. And one of the things that we've been hearing a lot as we've been exploring and hearing feedback from you about the executive pastoral position, and then also looking for a youth pastor in the coming months. The big question on everybody's mind is, can we afford this? And so Rick Moes is our treasurer, and he's going to give us some information on that exact question. But I think most of you don't even know who he is yet. And so I'm just going to ask Rick to tell us who you are. Where did you come from? Why are you here?
Some good questions. I think it's probably best just to start answering that question with the fact that you probably know our son and his wife and their family better, and that's Eric and Karis Moes. And ultimately, the reason why we're here is because they were here first. I think if you go back a number of years, we actually moved to BC for our first time back in 1992. And we were here for 14 years. And that's basically when we raised our kids. They've always known BC as home. And it was made very clear over the ensuing years that they were all going to eventually settle here. And that's exactly what happened. Our daughter, who is a teacher, she ultimately made her way across the country teaching in various places and finally got herself in Langley. And then, of course, you know that Eric and Karis have the farm not far from here. And it just became obvious to us, looking at where I was, work-wise, career-wise, what a perfect time to think about to retire. So we came back to BC back in early May of 2019. But backing up even further, Chris and I are from Ontario. We grew up in London. That was always home. We have a lot of family still back there. Worked actually, look at it from a work perspective, kind of worked a number of years here in the lower mainland, but obviously a good chunk of it was done in the Ontario area as well. I had the privilege, blessed, to be born and raised in a Christian home. I was 20 years old in a very quiet sort of way, but came to that place in my life where I had to kind of get off the fence. I couldn't hang on to the coattails of my parents' faith anymore. And in the summer when I turned 20, that's when I came to that place where I felt that I needed to lay claim to that faith. So through repentance and choosing to follow Jesus. And it's been quite an exciting ride over the last 40 years. But a little bit of a snapshot there, but yeah, so here we are. We've been back, I guess, coming up almost to two years now. Absolutely love being back. Love being close to the grandkids. And in all honesty, when you have a taste of BC and you've lived here before, you got to admit it's a pretty cool place to live and stay. Yeah. And I can't argue that point. So it's good to be back.
Nice, that's great. So yeah, what's a little bit of background? Just what did you do for work? What's your career background? So
the bulk of it, close to 40 years that I worked, was all in the aerospace industry. I started off years and years ago working on the shop floor as a machinist and making machined aerospace parts. And over the years, kind of just grew my way up, went back to night school for years. And the last 13 years, just prior to coming here, I was the general manager of a large machine shop in Kitchener, Ontario. And that's what I did. So it's a very strong manufacturing background. But it kept me busy.
Yeah. And what about ministry? You've been involved in church ministry in various capacities. What are some of those things you kind of bring to the table here as one as our treasurer, but also you're helping us out in some other ways too?
Yeah, so I've been involved in a variety of ways. I mean, I've been a treasurer before a number of years ago, and earlier on, when Chris and I were first married. But I think the biggest chunk was after we had moved back to Ontario in 2006, where we ended up in Ontario, where we lived, and the church we were going to. Really struck up a friendship with the senior pastor there, and got involved with this whole idea of what strategic development is. That's an area that was kind of new to him. So I remember very well, there was a morning, he invited me and another fella for a breakfast meeting, and he started by simply asking, what is strategic development and how do I do it in the context of church and church life? And that's kind of where it started. Got involved in a lot of things over the 13 years that we were back there. And I even did a 4-year stint as an elder as well. So very, very familiar with that role as well. But I think it stems from my background as well. I'm kind of a very an operationally focused person. The administrative side, the how to do side, how to make things happen side of things, and being able to do that in a church setting, not just related to my work, but also doing it in the context of church and church development was always very exciting as well. Awesome.
And you even served a little bit on staff at your church too, right?
Yes. So funny we should mention that. The last few years we were there, we went through a whole vision process again. The actual church was at that point was about 165 years in existence. It's been around for a long, long time in a very small Ontario town. And they just reached a place where they wanted to kind of revisit what vision is, and we went through that process. And through it all came this whole idea of how do you build structure at a church, and the whole idea of executive pastor came up. And actually, when I did retire from my aerospace work, I was the executive pastor for 1 year. At the time when I took the position, I didn't know for sure yet we were coming out back to the West Coast. But I did promise the pastor then and the elders back there that I would do it for a minimum of a year to a maximum until my 60th birthday. Well, the year came first. But we were able to do a lot of things. We were able to get a lot of structure in place, and I resigned that position. We moved here, but the church immediately filled that position again. And I know because I keep in touch a little bit with Chris, the senior pastor there, and they're off doing some really cool things where they feel God has led them.
Excellent. So I didn't ask you this before, but I just thought of it now. I thought it'd be good. What benefit did that bring to the church at that point to move from whatever structure you had to having you come on as executive pastor? And they've obviously continued that because they saw the value in that role. What was the key thing that kind of, I guess, helped that become an established role that they felt the church needed?
I think, the church was growing. A number of years prior to that, it was a very, very small country church. There was 50 people there. They were kind of at a place as, what are we going to do? Because if we don't do something different, we're probably going to cease to exist, because it was in a very, very small rural town. And at that time, the collection of rather senior people swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and said, what, we're gonna look to God and really find out, it's a different road we should walk. And that's what they did. You got to give these guys credit for doing that. Well, within the first 5 years, the church grew to, it peaked out about 500 people. Young families were back. A vibrant youth group came back. The children's ministry and so forth. But you reach a point of size where you really start to understand and realize that structure becomes important. How do you organize a church? How do you bring responsibility and accountability into play? How do you ensure that the vision, that the elders really feel is important is actually being met, that you're actually executing that vision? And through that process, which did span a number of years, they slowly moved to this idea of creating the executive pastor position. In actual fact, before they hired me for that first year stint, me and another person actually did it. We were actually called volunteer EPs. We actually did it. We shared some responsibility, and we did it in our spare time after working hours, and we started implementing things, and then eventually came to a place where we could make it a full-time position. But to me, I think it just flows from this idea, as a church grows, it lives out its vision, and how do you, it's about how do you become effective? How do you, this whole idea I said already about responsibility and accountability, and staying on track. But it's really tied to this whole vision thing.
Right. Excellent. Well, changing gears to where we're at now and some of the questions that we're facing, I thought it'd be good for the church to just hear a little bit of what your core philosophy is as our treasurer, what kind of core principles you have in church finances, and how you approach that, how you view that, and anything along those lines.
Yeah, so there's probably three kind of major principles of sorts that I kind of stick to, because I've just found over the years as I've learned these and seen them in action, they just kind of make sense to me. And the first one is really the whole idea of ministry, and what ministry that you will do actually flows from vision. And that vision is that clear-cut roadmap where as a church you really believe this is where God is calling us to go. But then of course, prayer and discernment precedes vision. A senior pastor, elders, as they kind of struggle with the strategic implications of what a vision is, it has to rest, it has to be built on this idea of prayer and discerning. And so that to me, is the fundamental point, is prayer and discernment produces vision. Vision will define what your ministry thrusts are. The second point that I've learned is you cannot be everything to everybody. No organization can, and a church can't either. And the interesting thing is there are an endless list of worthy things to do. Yep. But you can't do them all. And I think if a church or any organization for that matter attempts to try to do more than what they can, your resources, not just financial resources, but people resources as well, it gets spread too thin. And then what ends up happening, well, you might be doing a lot of things, nothing is really being done all that well. That's the risk you run into. And that's why I think, going back to that first principle, this prayer, right, discernment, vision, it brings clarity to what you really believe God is calling the church to do, which is primarily the function of elders and the senior pastor to figure that out. Right. But it brings clarity to that. The third one is this whole idea of what excellence is. And excellence is not the same thing as perfection. Perfection is actually based on pride, and we kind of know that when pride runs amok, what the consequences of that are. But excellence is a worthy model because God is excellent, and what God does is excellent, and we're image bearers. So the idea of excellence is kind of wired into us in the sense that even though we might not achieve it, but having that mindset of doing things well I think is a form of honoring God, because I think he set the example first.
Right.
And to some degree, I think, we're capable of doing things with that spirit of excellence. So those are kind of the three things that I think, in my mind has evolved over time, that I think to this point, well, Doug can attest to it, and I imagine some of the other staff people here can as well. I've talked a lot about this.
Yep.
So then, when you really think about it then, well, okay, you have three principles. Okay, what does that have to do with us? Well, if you look in scripture anywhere, Old, New Testament, when God called someone to do a task, and pick anyone you want, there's so many of them, there's so many stories you can use. Mm-hmm. God always provided the resources and the means to complete that task. We were never, ever left alone. Now, I'm not suggesting it's not easy. I mean, it can be very difficult. And sometimes there's a lot of personal growth. There's a lot of maturity that takes place as well. The path is not always easy. But when you are called, God also then provides, and you're not left alone. Well, you might say, well, okay, that's great at an individual basis, but we're talking about a church. Well, a church isn't a building, and it isn't an institution as well. It's actually the body of Christ. It's us. It's people. It's us who claim to follow him. So therefore, I think the same concept applies. If God is going to call Gospel Chapel to a particular task, a particular mission, it's crafted through the vision, and it's executed because that is where we believe God is calling us. And in reality, when you look, where this all started, back in March, the elders, Doug, they came out and said, this is where we're at, this is what we're thinking. And what was the first thing they asked us to do? It was to pray. And let's mull this over in terms of the elders as they've been working the last while on this idea of vision again, and ultimately where God is taking this church. And you think about that, the day and age we live in. It's not just this whole COVID thing and the fact that we just celebrated our first year of not really having what we all know and love. Yeah. But, you look at society at large. I mean, the world has changed a lot. Mm-hmm. And it's changing in a very rapid way. And not everything is for the better. And I really think we have a role to play as a church, as a body of believers, the local church. And I think the elders are working that process out. And you're now seeing really the first two questions that are going to be presented as motions and saying, hey, do we want to establish this position? And the second one being is Ben, able to fill that position. And it goes back to those three principles again, that process. But it's this idea of vision. And I know that it's been mentioned. I think, very soon as well, we're going to kind of restrike a vision committee of sorts, a team, and review that and dig deeper and through prayer and discernment, start mapping out this journey where God is calling Gospel Chapel to go.
Right. So that all sits on top of this question of, well, how do we pay for it? Right? Because that's from everything. I think a lot of people they get the, we need to move forward. There's changes we need to make in order to kind of grow the ministry of Gospel Chapel. And we can have 200, 300 people here on a day, but there's thousands of people in Grand Forks and around the boundary that still don't follow Jesus, and we want to know. We want to push into that. So we have to make some changes, and we have to invest in, our own time, our own energy, but also our own finances. And then corporately as a church body, how do we discern, what ministry initiatives to take? And then behind all of that, there's just a cost. There's the reality of our world and where we live, that ministry actually has dollar figures to it. So, you know, even if we nail down a compelling vision, communicate it well, pursue excellence in our ministries, that's kind of the top layer, I think I'm hearing you say. Underneath us, though, is where kind of the rubber meets the road, is what is this going to cost us and how can we do it?
Yeah. So paint a little bit of a picture first, right? So I think we all agree that 2020 was an interesting year. Let's leave it at that. I think that can open up a huge debate as to what was so interesting about it. And I look at it and I say, okay, now I've been doing this for almost a year now in terms of the role here at Gospel Chapel. I took over last March 1st from Rob. And basically, I'll just start off by saying, and you would have seen it in the AGM, the rather modified, shortened AGM report that just went out 2 or 3 weeks back. And the financial report was in there as well, and I'll just review that. You know, we ended 2020 better, in a better financial position than we did in 2019. And when I consider the year, that's not a bad thing to say. I think that's pretty cool. Yeah. And I look at it, there's $220,000 in the bank at the end of the year versus $192 the previous year. The general fund has a surplus in it of $90K versus $88. The building fund is $96 instead of $78K. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the last major fund that has funding in it, which actually is an interesting discussion in itself, was the Christmas hamper program of this year. Mm-hmm. Massive contribution from within this church, but also the community at large. Yeah. It has a $22K balance in it as compared to the previous year at $10. So all in all, when you look at it, we are in a better financial position. And one of the things that, I think when you're the treasurer and you get to look at this stuff, it really points out to me a characteristic of Gospel Chapel as well when you look at the history of this church and what has gone on over the years. And, I think it's fair to say there is a lot of faithful people who remain so even after a rather interesting year. So I'm just creating a positive picture. Mm-hmm. But I think, I know so, there's a lot of churches out there that have not done very well in 2020. And you know what? It's not for us to say the why, but the reality is a lot of churches went in the other directions financially. Mm-hmm. We actually, I think, not only, we grew a little bit, we actually held our own. So our starting point, I think, is a good place. And then if I think that question, the way you phrased it, we're healthy. Right. Now it doesn't really explain, how are we going to afford it? And so if I answer that question, I think there's a real easy answer I can say, and I will. But before I say that, I want to go back to my 3 principles again. And in actual fact, in discussion with Doug last week, I think, even an elder articulated this as well in a conversation he had with somebody from the church. And it is simply this, if we are obedient and we are faithful and we are following, what God's call is, then the last thing we should be worrying about is the financial side of it or the resource side of it, because I do believe that God does provide, and I've seen countless examples of that over the years in various contexts. When people are faithful and are obedient and follow what God is calling them to do. And I believe that to be true for Gospel Chapel as well. So that's kind of the pat answer. God will provide. But personally speaking, as we transition, assuming these initiatives take hold, and we do it, there is an assumption as we implement this is that the journey starts. Gospel Chapel is doing whatever God calls it to do in the community at large, whatever those ministry focuses are going to be. And it's blessed. There's growth, opportunities, and and that's kind of, from a human perspective, that's how it kind of works. I just think it's key that we remain faithful and look to God, because He provides. Now, the other part of this is, and this I'll express it as a personal opinion. We have $90,000 in the general fund. If we have defined vision, the elders and Doug are leading in that vision, and we're prepared to execute it, let's spend it. I'm not saying that in a frivolous way. Mm-hmm. I'm tying it heavily to this idea of what vision is and how you execute vision in that obedience and faithful response to what God is leading the church to do. Why would we not, with a carefully crafted vision, discernment, prayer, why would we not want to use some of those funds and reap the reward of what those ministry initiatives might be? So how does that sound?
Yeah, well, I think, with that, we are going to be launching within the next few weeks, kind of a small group of us will get together, and we're going to start the process of what is it that God's calling us to. After Easter, we'll be starting a sermon series through Nehemiah, talking about, when God gives us a burden to do something, He provides the means. Now, it doesn't mean that we sit back and just wait for God to do stuff. We'll see through Nehemiah's example that he prays first for months on it. He plans during that time of prayer because he knows that he's going to need resources. So he has a plan all set to go. And then he executes that plan and sticks to it. And there's struggles, there's challenges when God gives us a vision. Like you said, it doesn't mean everything's easy. It doesn't come simply. It doesn't come without conflict and tension. But as we move down that road, we'll see God provide and things move in the direction as He blesses it, and as we're walking in obedience to Him. And that's really the challenge of the discernment. And that's, again, as Rick mentioned, why we asked you to be spending these weeks prior to answering any vote and prayer and discussion with one another. I know a lot of you have contacted some of our elders and discussed everything about this that you can think of at this time. And there's also a part of this too, where when we're following God's vision, we do have to take steps of faith. It's not, we will not ever have everything spelled out for us in absolute detail as to how it's going to go, what's going to work, whether we're going to be stretched financially. We may be. But where's the place for faith in all of this too? Because obedience requires a great degree of faith at times. And so, I guess at the end of the day, we're asking the question, and I think Rick's kind of answered it in a very general way. Can we afford pastor number 3?
So let's put some real numbers out there. So it's 2021. There's 2 motions that will be presented. I think we're voting on them at the end of the month. And let's just assume at this point in time that we're going to go forward with it. Okay? Being a little bit presumptuous, but let's just assume at this stage. So what does that mean for the balance of 2021? Okay, Ben is, if Ben is if that motion passes well and Ben assumes that, the primary change for Ben is he's changing his role.
Right.
He's already here, he's already on full-time staff. Now, in all honesty, there's probably going to be a small salary adjustment simply because we're asking him to take on a different role and a role with more responsibility and accountability. But for the, but that's a fairly small number, and I don't know what that is yet. Some of those discussions have to take place yet. But that's, almost a wash in the sense of what's going to happen in 2021.
Right.
The big change is, and as we progress down this road, if we want to have a youth pastor, and let's just assume it's a half-time position, okay? If all goes well and we're ready, it's September. So you're talking a half-time position for 4 months, okay? That's approximately $10,000. So in the grand scheme of things, as we develop this organizational structure and we put Ben in a new role and we possibly bring on a part-time youth pastor in the fall, in September, you're looking at $10,000 increase that's kind of not in the budget yet. Now, if you go back to the AGM report, the financial portion that I wrote is we kind of laid out what's going to happen, right? We have an interim budget that's been approved, but we're going to present the final budget in its final form at the May AGM, whatever format that takes place at, depending on what we're allowed to do.
Might be out in the parking lot.
Might be out in the parking lot, but the final rendition will be presented that time, and depending on where we are, that $10,000 increase might be built into it at that point in time for the youth pastor. Now going into 2022, that's obviously where the picture grows a little bit more, because now, of course, you have your half-time youth pastor staying on for the entire year, which is a $30,000 round number kind of addition. But then, of course, as this vision takes hold and it starts to unfold, what ministry initiatives will be born from that also will require possibly funding or a change in funding in terms of what we have done in the past. And of course, those questions haven't been answered yet. So in one sense, I think 2022 is the more interesting year in terms of finances and where we'll be, and not so much 2021. Right.
So, short answer, can we afford it? Yes.
I think so. Yes.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Rick. Thanks for bringing us, introducing yourself to probably the wider church, and getting a face to the name. Many of you may not have met him before, so it's great to have that introduction and just kind of some answers to that big question. Can we afford to move Ben into this new role and bring on a third pastoral staff member, and seeing that that's not only possible, but my other question would be, can we afford not to do this? And I think that's something, I feel that, we do need to move forward in some new directions. And just as I've worked with Ben for almost 3 years now, seeing where his strengths are, and we talked a lot about this when Ben and I sat down and had a conversation like this, about how we feel that our teamwork and our strengths and our offsetting weaknesses are going to help us to serve the church better and serve the mission that God has for us at this time and in this place. And so in a way, I and again, this is just me saying this isn't coming from the board or anything, it's just like, we can't afford not to do this in many ways. And so,
well, I think the one way to look at it, I keep saying 2020 was an interesting year, and when Doug says we can't, can we afford not to do anything? In one sense, and I don't want to minimize, the grief that some people may have suffered through, I think, a very challenging year. Yeah. But I think from an overall church perspective, it has also created an opportunity, to relook at what we do, who we are, the community at large, the role of the church, what is the church, and so forth and so forth. And, that's not my responsibility, it's the elders' responsibility, but I do see it as an opportunity as well.
Right. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Rick, for taking the time to come in, have this conversation. I hope that helped, as we're, continuing to talk about this. The elders, myself and Pastor Ben, are spending the day together on Saturday working through some more material about, how do we how do we live and how do we move forward as God's people at this time and in this place. And we'll be spending time praying together. And, you know, the next 2 weeks, continue to be in prayer, continue to be in conversation, and really listen to God's leading in this. So, thanks, Rick, for coming in. And thank you for those of you who are watching. And God bless you as you move forward in this week, and continue to pray for us. Thanks.